Hey everyone, welcome to Running Retro. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do a gameplay review. I've been requested to do these by a few people over the life of our channel so far, and I thought it was about time. But as you all know, I don't like to do too many things traditionally, so we're going to look at Shinobi 3 and its progression gameplay. And what I mean by that is how the game teaches you how to play the game as it continues. And I think Shinobi 3 is a reasonably good example for this, and a reasonably good place to start to illustrate how games can do things to prepare you for the game later. Because many times when we've been playing and getting goods, I've said that the game has done something and then taught me to do it and punished me for teaching me to do it. And Shinobi 3 is one of the games that I think exemplifies. Let's jump right into the first level. As you'd expect, the first level is not too complicated. There's not too much to do. You're given a lot of enemies, but the enemies are pretty slow to react, they're slow to attack, and it gives you plenty of time to get a feel for the controls, to experiment, to learn about your projectiles, to learn about your melee attack. You get to learn about boxes, and you get to learn about traps inside of boxes, watching your shurikens and your shuriken stock. And it just gives you this really nice platform to start getting comfortable with the game. And there are other possibilities in this too. When you get towards the end of the stage, or the end of the first section, you could potentially learn the jump kick. And figuring out how to deal with the samurai enemies is really quite good, because it teaches you timing, it teaches you the speed of your jump, it even teaches you the hitboxes that you're going to be dealing with, and sort of where and when and how things are going to make contact with you. So that first area is just a perfect lead-in tutorial for what you're doing. Now, it does have a flaw, but we'll get to that more at the end. As you progress into the second stage of level 1, you're introduced to climbing. And you're introduced, if you explore a little bit, to wall jumping and to secret areas. Although you're more likely to find that on your second playthrough, which adds replayability to the game as well. Now, it also introduces floor hazards, and it introduces pits. So you kind of get a new perspective on what you're going to be up against. You get introduced to damage, instant death, and how to deal with that. Later on in the stage, you are forced to do wall jumps. There's no other way to progress. So you're guaranteed by the end of the stage to at least know that you can wall jump. And it also gets progressively more difficult, with more obstacles being thrown at you, needing to do some platform and actually interact with enemies. So far, you haven't really had to interact with enemies while doing anything extra. And they do add another secret after you're forced to learn how to wall jump, and you're heavily rewarded by that with an extra life. All of this culminates in the boss battle. This boss battle teaches you effectively your last movement strategy. The fact that you can double jump. So just single jumping is not quite enough to get over this boss, especially if you're playing for the first time. However, being able to double jump does get you over the boss. And it's also very likely at this point that you will discover the down kick just trying to attack the enemy, pressing down and hitting the attack button. You're going to accidentally find out that you can dive kick. And you're likely to do that as well while his swords are up, so you're going to learn that you're going to bounce harmlessly off of the enemy. So this first stage sets the whole game up very, very well. It doesn't pressure you with an incredible amount of difficulty, but it slowly introduces these beginning mechanics so that you're able to get used to them and you're able to play around with them and interact with the enemies sort of on your terms rather than on theirs. And then as it progresses, it's a little bit more on their terms and slowly pushes you to react and learn what you're doing and interact much more with the game. All to set you up for the next level where the difficulty rises just a little bit to meet your increasing skill set. Now, the second stage starts with a completely different background. You're suddenly on a horse. You have a whole different perspective. You have a different mode of gameplay, and you have just a different interaction with it. And that's a pretty good reset button because the game is teaching different skills in this section than it did in the first section. Enemies are much more mobile in this. In the first stage, they are very stationary. Here, they're moving both in the foreground and the background. And you're also introduced to obstacles in your way, and you're forced to time your jumps to avoid that. So it builds up your timing and your pacing. It also teaches you shuriken management because this is where, though you probably already realized it a bit, your shurikens are in limited quantity and you'll be using a lot of them. And this forces you to use a lot of them so that you're taught that the game understands how many you'll go through and how many you'll need, and you don't have to worry about using too many of them. You need to be aware of the fact that that exists, but that overall the game is designed with the intention that you're going to use a lot of shurikens. And then the mid boss teaches you all of the things in the level join together. You have a moving foe, you have obstacles to dodge, and you are needing to learn your projectile speed, your projectile pacing, and how to use it optimally. So all of those things in the first section of stage 2 are all just lined up, and they culminate in this mini boss battle that asks you to execute all of it. Not in a difficult way. It's very friendly and it's very good for an introduction, but it still asks that of you. Now that you've made it through that section, you're introduced to what you're familiar with. And now you've got differing levels of platforms. So you're actually having to traverse a landscape that isn't just run forward. You had a little bit of that, but this is more intense. And you also come across different platforms with items on them. So you learn that you can grab those things and that you can jump off of them. And it teaches you that you can grab and hang if you hadn't already learned that in the previous level. And it just sort of goes to reinforce that. It also encourages you to explore. It's followed with your first auto scroller. And this takes a lot of the movement things that you've already learned. You've learned now that you don't need to worry too much about projectiles, and it forces you to use that. But it also teaches you enemy spawning, that some things, your movement can trigger enemy spawns. It also teaches you how to just traverse the area in a forced pace so that you're not rushing ahead. You're having to take time to really interact with these platforms. And it gives you an opportunity to test your double jump as well. So it doesn't force you to use the double jump in most cases, but it does encourage you to try and expand your movement options. So you have time to explore, you have time to experiment, and you have time to learn without huge repercussions and punishment. And lastly, when you get to the boss is very much mobile and faster than you are. So it teaches you how to interact with an enemy that is really heavily on the move. And if you think about it, no enemy up to this point has actually been very mobile. They've all been reasonably stationary or just walking towards you. So this is the first time you really see something that is moving erratically, moving relatively quickly, has a varied and wide move set, but it also makes sure that you're comfortable with your movement options and your interactions, especially when the boss can reverse your controls. So now you've learned how to deal with varying levels of terrain, enemies that both have projectiles and are stationary, horizontal and vertical movement, and enemies that can move in all four directions and faster than you. So you're starting to get a pretty good feel in a slow ramp of what the capabilities are of your character and how those interact with the world. And you've also learned how to conserve and manage your shurikens and your ammunition. Starting with body enemy, you're introduced to enemies that can come from above and from below at the same time. And also enemies that can come from truly below you. So both the brain flies and the zombies actually have a way of attacking you from directly underneath your feet where you can't hit them. The zombies through rising up directly underneath you if you're not being aware, and the brain flies by flying down below you if you don't kill them in time, and then swooping up underneath you. And the stage is relatively forgiving because of that. So you don't have too much difficulty. It's just interacting with you more on a four directional axis and teaching you that you're going to be expecting and needing to deal with things coming from every direction. So the previous boss in 2-2, it was able to move in four directions, but always stayed above you or on a horizontal plane with you. Now, your basic enemies are slowly coming at you, but they're coming at you from all four directions. So now you have to be aware of what's above you and what's below you. And then you encounter the first time where the floor is really truly a danger zone. You've seen spikes, you've seen little moments where things are temporarily treacherous, but now the floor is just deadly. And this is a good way to introduce this because instead of just giving you wide open pits that are instant death, instead they're giving you something where you can make a mistake and you're going to get punished for it because you're going to lose life. But it's not so brutally punishing that it's frustrating. And you also learn much more about the double jump because one single jump is not enough to take you through this level. You're going to take some damage. And by adding the double jump, you're able to dodge the attacks. This also means that as you go through the level, you can take the damage and just tank it. It's just going to feel bad, and it's going to make you think about, is there a better way I can do this? The game naturally teaches you to think about it in other alternative ways that you might not have approached it at this point. The mini boss once again compiles all these things. You have an uneven terrain, you have a damaging floor, and you have a lot of enemies coming at you from different directions. And it's not quite as hard as some of the level could have been because they're still approaching you on a generally horizontal axis, but it does make you work with a lot of differing and shifting parameters. The second part of the stage introduces even more hazards. Not in a damaging sense, because the floor allowing you to sink or forcing you to sink isn't so much a hazard in the sense that it does damage to you, but it does mean that you have to be, again, much more aware of your surroundings because you have the boss in the background targeting you, which is something you've never had before. So you're under a certain amount of pressure to move forward, which the game hasn't really pushed you to move through a stage quickly. Now it does. Now it teaches you your forward movement and how to try and push as fast as you can through a level so you take as little damage as possible. And now, as far as the enemy list goes, it's solely from underneath you. There's nowhere else that it's coming from except for this targeting boss behind you that you're trying to outrace. Now, when you finally get to the boss, it's still going to be attacking you both from below, from above, and from directly in front of you. So its main beam attack forces you to space yourself so that you can get underneath it and time the attack. And it's teaching your timing. There's a narrow weak point, so it forces you to have precision on your attacks. And it teaches you how to move with your jump kick, how to dodge. It just forces you to move in every single direction with a variety of attacks that also encourage this gameplay and encourage you to build your skill up here. Now, there is actually one easier way to deal with this, but that again is one of the faults of the game that we will get to towards the end. But you have this boss culminating in a terrain that's working against you, plus attacks coming from above, and attacks coming from below, and attacks coming from on your level, horizontally. So you really are forced to utilize everything that you've seen up to this point, all coalesced into one boss, coupled with the precision of hitting his weak spot. As you progress into the fourth stage, you're introduced once again to a different style of play, being on this jet ski. But what this does is, unlike the horse, which added a little bit of movement, but you were able to remain relatively stationary and approach the obstacles as they came, in this case, it gives the feel of a lot more speed, and it gives the feel of a lot more urgency. Plus, you now have enemies coming at you from above and from below, and you've got these timed jumps. So instead of pushing you to purely dodge things, it's encouraging you now to see something on a faster moving level and react and recognize it in a very, very short period of time. You also get your first enemies that are attacking you from behind. So now you've learned that all four directions are completely okay for enemies to attack you. So you don't know whether you're going to be attacked from front, behind, above, or below, and what's going to be put before you in your path in the meantime. And the game is kind of establishing itself at this point that the kids' gloves are starting to come off now, and that you need to be ready for just about anything. And the boss here is not too difficult. It's kind of a breather comparatively from all the others, but what it does do is it has a good range of horizontal and vertical attacks, and that gives you the opportunity to really test out those skills that you've used thus far. So you get the opportunity to react a little bit more without too much punishment, but also to get a little bit of a breather and get yourself ready for the next section. And the next section is where the game really starts coming into its own as far as difficulty. Now, not only are you moving forward relatively quickly, you're not forced to push forward as fast as possible. You're allowed to take a little bit more of a measured pace, but because of enemies that have larger and wider attacks, it does mean that your movement to dodge a lot of these things has to be broader. And that does mean that you're moving more than you would have in previous areas where you're just fighting one enemy here and there. And it also teaches you a lot more about your platforming, your levels. So moving up and down between levels, that's introduced here as a necessity. And you're also taught that boxes and weapon crates can be used as a standing point. So you can actually use these things you've been breaking and getting shurikens, getting power-ups, extra lives, all that good stuff. You can actually use those as ways to traverse through a stage. You can use them as a way to get a solid footing. You're also introduced to flying enemies that attack you from off-screen. So the brain flies, you could see those a mile away and you could prepare for them. But now you actually have to react to what's coming in front of you and from an angle that you didn't necessarily expect. And they have projectiles. You're also reintroduced to stage hazards, but those stage hazards are now from above rather than from below. Even though you've experienced the oil drums a little bit, and that's sort of a hazard that's below you, the jets of steam are much more akin to those more traditional stage hazards. And the drums are not too bad. They're just sort of a gentle way to remind you that there can be hazards below, but the real ones that will knock you out of the sky and into a pit are those steam vents. You're also rewarded here for exploration with extra lives and with extra power ups. So even though you're being pushed forward, you're being allowed to explore. And that's part of the reason you're not being pushed forward is they want you to realize that the power ups and that the extra lives, the extra shurikens, all that stuff is in the stage. It's just hidden and you now need to go exploring for it. It's much less in the direct path. The boss of the level just goes to reaffirm that enemies can now attack you from anywhere because it has attacks that come from every single angle. It can move in front of you, it can move behind you, and the fact that it has multiple forms and it's quite aggressive in all of those forms lets you know that all bets are off. There's no just beat the boss now once and then you're fine. No. If you take out the boss, there might be something else waiting for you in the wings. So you need to be on your toes, and until you see that level screen ending, you need to make sure you're aware of what's going on. And that's going to carry on into the next act. Now officially a hazard. And you have a lot of enemies that are attacking you on many axes. So you're not just having to worry about moving forward and where an enemy is attacking you, but the ground that you're standing on is always or almost always a threat. So it keeps you on your toes and it very much keeps you pushing forward. So this is where the game really picks up its pace and is forcing you to pick up its pace so that you need to run reasonably blindly into new obstacles and then adjust as you can with relatively precise platforming, because if your platforming is incorrect, then you're just going to get hit. So there's no more holding of the hand and there's no more letting you take your time, see what's going to happen, plan out your move. This is much more run ahead, see what's happening, and react with your move. So if your muscle memory at this point hasn't gotten accustomed to the character controls and hasn't gotten accustomed to the gameplay, then you're suddenly going to be hitting a wall and it's going to force you to go die and go back and learn by beating it again until you can get to this stage with that muscle memory ingrained. And that's why I think that this stage really is the turning point in the difficulty of the game, where it really starts to ramp up. And it's not terrible. It's not super punishing. It just asks you that you've really learned what it's shown you in the previous stages. And if you haven't, go back and learn it. The mid boss is not really that bad again, but it does reintroduce that idea of a lot of speed in the game. So enemies being faster than you and you having to react. Now you're having to think ahead for a single enemy and what's going to happen and how you're going to approach it. And there's almost always some hint of what's going on. So you need to be very aware of the enemy so that you can actually adjust and react accordingly, one can hope. And this is sort of similar to the very first boss, just faster and hits harder. So the same thing works, actually, to jump over its lasers here. You can just double jump, but a single jump will get you over the enemy now, and if you thread that needle, you're rewarded with a couple extra hits. All in all, not too bad. It just asks you to modify something that it has already shown you. And once again, afterwards, the game is now going to shift its modes a little bit, and you're introduced to a stage that you can now walk on the ground. However, that luxury is going to go away. So now you see how the levels can be affected by the actual items in the levels. And it is actively teaching you that not all of these things are good, but some are necessary. So even if something seems bad, like these traps, they can have a different purpose. And by removing the floor, you're now absolutely forced to come to terms with your jumping abilities and with your climbing and grappling abilities. If you haven't learned it at this point, you're going to die a lot. You're going to game over, and you're going to have to go back to the beginning and learn it again. So, didn't do it well enough? Well, go learn and find it out. And that's really healthy because you don't want to introduce new things that your player just gets unbelievably frustrated with and really ruins their play experience. Here the difficulty is ramped up enough that if you don't have the skill, you're not going to have fun with the game beyond this point. And so the game kind of tells you, okay, you're not going to have fun beyond this point, you need to learn this. Go back and learn it. And it's no mistake that at the start you do have training wheels. The floor does exist when you start this level. It just goes away. And it's one more sign that the training wheels are coming off. And you really need to be prepared for what's going to happen after. And maybe most importantly, the very last platform teaches you that the traps and the boxes can actually be set off with your projectiles, which becomes really important in a couple other sections of the next level and of the final level. It also teaches you, if you hadn't learned at this point somehow, that you can break open boxes with your shuriken, all of which is really key and is going to make the game impossible to progress if you don't already know that. So the game is making 100% sure that you know these things by forcing you to figure them out or not progress. When you finally get to the boss, you're once again hit by something that can attack you from multiple directions. And the boss doesn't really teach you that much as it just gives you an opportunity to hone your skills even further. Because the window of opportunity for attack and for defense, for dodging, is just narrower than it's ever been. So it's still just forcing you to make sure that your precision is up to the task of what's going to be at hand. It also incidentally teaches you that beam projectiles can be destroyed by attacking them. So you're not guaranteed to notice that. You can dodge them, but it is a potential lesson. And that's one of the points where this starts to lose a little bit, because your movement is getting complex enough and things are getting complicated enough now that the game doesn't have the best way of teaching you all of these little nuances. And that is a little bit of a problem. But the fact of the matter is, you're likely to do it at least by accident. So you're still likely to learn, but this is where things start to fall apart just a little bit. Now, with that said, stage 6 is the moment where you need to have your movement down, you need to have your precision down, and you need to be able to operate under stressful conditions with a cool head. If you can't perform to that level, then you're never going to beat this stage. This is the hard wall. Have you learned this stuff or not? If yes, you can make it through it. If not, you're going to die and you're going to have to go back and learn it better. Because this horizontal section of movement, you need to be able to do your double jump. Without it, you can't progress. And you need to be relatively pinpoint with your projectiles. You need to have enough projectiles. If you've died and you've lost a bunch, then you're going to be on an extreme ration of those projectiles. And the boss is relatively simple, but just teaches you to be very, very careful about where your placement is on the screen. So this is the first of 2 hard walls here that make sure your movement is up to snuff and you are capable of traversing further in the game. The second section of the level teaches you very precise movement while dodging, and it demands that you're able to do it. Because if you can't, you're going to hit those weapon crates, you're going to break them, and then you're not going to be able to progress. So that can be quite frustrating, especially once you get through it and you get to these walls that you need to be able to wall jump off of, control your wall jumps, and then be able to do your double jumps as well. And this is, again, another one of those parts where the game starts to fall apart a little bit, because where those are is very, very specific, and it's a little bit hit or miss whether you get hit by those spikes. So the lesson is still there, but the actual gameplay struggles with that a hair. And a lot is demanded of you at this point, too. Because now, if you can't get over these sections without taking a lot of damage, and you're going straight into a boss battle, then, you know, you're going to have a really, really rough time in that boss battle. And you're basically guaranteed to die. There is some point here that just jumping on the top and accepting some damage is fine, which can be very important in the last level, but I don't think that's entirely the lesson they were trying to teach there. I think they really were trying to force people to be incredibly precise, perhaps more precise than the game is fully capable of letting the average player be. The boss here is not the worst. It just requires you to react to what's going on screen. So now you've got a boss that's much more reaction than anything else. And it's just a measured approach and reacting to what you see. So he's not that hard, but getting to him with enough health to handle him is very difficult. And that's what I think that's what the programmers were going for here. They really wanted you to experience that, you know, that difficulty prior, and sort of the gatekeeper is, can you get to him with enough health to manage him and enough resources? Because as you can see here, after a death, you have almost no shurikens. You've got just enough to handle this boss. So you still need to be very precise. You can be really patient, but you need to be very precise with your projectiles and make sure that, you know, you really aren't wasting much, if anything at all. And that's the takeaway from this boss fight. Because going into the last area, a lot more is going to be demanded. And the last level doesn't really give you any opportunity to learn anything else. From here on out, the game expects you to have really gotten the movement down and really have learned it. You're going to go through an area with 0 floor and very few enemies for what you've seen up to this point, but the enemies are really more just environmental hazards. So not ninjas, not robots, not, you know, anything else like that. No, now you're just facing environmental hazards which can effectively just kill you upon contact. You can potentially take some damage, but since you're just going to get knocked down into a pit, most of these things, if they hit you, are just going to kill you. And your platforming has to be spot on. Towards the end of the first section, there are 2, you must do a double jump or you die. In the auto-scrolling section, you may not have to worry so much about the environmental hazards, but it does ask that you are really, really pinpoint with all of your actions, and if you are not, then you're going to get hit. So this is execute it perfectly or get punished. And they're nice after the first section where it was execute it perfectly or die, and now it's execute it perfectly or just take some damage. But even that is, now you're into this battle of attrition, and you have to deal with it. Because the rest of the game is going to be nothing but attrition. There really aren't any of those more traditional enemies. They're all ground hazards. They're all like shooting hazards and these cannons projectiles, that sort of stuff. So they're all stationary targets at odd angles or really damaging. And once you get through that, then you're into a section that demands almost perfect platforming and a real true mastery of the movement mechanics of the game. The floors are damaging, the ceilings are damaging, there's instant death all over the place. If you mess up, you're either going to take damage or die, and you're just going to get ground down. And this is all leading up to the final boss. So as I said, there's nothing really more that the game teaches you from here on out. It's just a how well has it taught you those things up to this point? And are you capable of executing? Now, when you finally do manage to get to the final boss requires you to react because of his varying moveset, to plan ahead and be patient, because if you just attack him, he just blocks and there's nothing that you can do about it. And you need to goad him into things. So you really need to be in control of your character and in control of what's going on in the game, or else you don't stand much of a chance against that final boss. And that's the culmination of all the skills, which is really what a final boss should be. And for that reason, that ending level, though brutal, is also infinitely fair, because you should have learned all of these things up to this point. Now, there is one fly in the ointment. The game does fail, in my opinion, to teach you one very, very key ability. You can block in this game. And I never knew that. It says something that the game actually teaches you how to deal with all of these hazards. It just doesn't teach you to block. And I looked in the manual as well, and it's not listed in the manual as a move. So I'm not sure that they actually intended for you to learn that. And one other caveat to this, I play this on a 3-button controller because that's what was shipped with the Genesis. And I do know that you can use a 6-button controller with the Genesis and get a dedicated button for blocking and a dedicated button for your melee ability. But you don't have that to start. And to enable the 6-button controller is actually a code you have to enter in at the beginning of the game. So I don't think that's entirely intentional. It's sort of like a secret easy mode. But in the end, this game takes this concept of what you need to do, and every single level slowly builds upon itself until it finally culminates in this challenge that it asks you to do everything that it's taught you to do. And there's nothing here that the game didn't show you previously that it asks you to do. And so many games get that wrong or miss that point. And you never get punished for not knowing something because you've been shown it first in a controlled environment where it was relatively easy, relatively straightforward, or relatively simple to do it and execute it. And then the difficulty just slowly ramped so that your precision had to rise with it as your familiarity with the game rose with it. And that's why I think Shinobi 3 really is a masterpiece, because very few games are able to teach you every core mechanic of the game as effectively and as well as this one, while making it feel like a natural experience. And there's no tutorial here. There's no individual set aside space that you have to play before you can actually jump into the game. No, the game teaches you everything you need to know by letting you play the game and experience the game. And to me, that's the best design you can have for gameplay and for the gaming experience. So Shinobi 3, in my opinion, is one of the best designed games ever made as far as teaching the player, encouraging the player, and walking the player through their game without being incredibly easy or a pushover. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this retrospect. Let me know what you think about this approach down in the comments below. I do intend to look at some other games that I may feel a little less favorable about as far as how they approach that with the player. If you'd like to see other styles of reviews, if you'd like to see something in this vein but on a different subject, then please let me know. Leave comments, talk to me about this stuff. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. If you haven't, please like and subscribe, and we will be back tomorrow with our Fire Emblem stream. So we hope to see you there, and we'll see you all later.